Education as a field of study is multidisciplinary in nature, and there are several other disciplines or subjects that combine to provide the basis for the theory and practice of education. In this presentation that is aimed at students who are beginners in the field of education, we will have an overview of the foundations of education, or those subjects and discipline that combine together to give insights regarding the theory and practice of education. So, what are the foundations of education? Let us have a brief overview. First, the foundations of education, as the very name suggests, is basically represent a core of or a core body of knowledge or theory that supports and that informs the field of study or the processes of education. So as I said in the beginning, education is basically a multidisciplinary subject, and in order to have the foundational knowledge of education is important for beginning teachers or for educationists or for students of the field of education. Why? Because it enables educators to understand the why of education. So why education exists? What is the purpose of the process of education? How has education evolved over a period of time, or how can we actually look back at education in a historical context? Thirdly, what purposes the process or the concept of education serves within a society. So these foundations that we will have a brief overview in the upcoming slides. These provide foundations, and these foundations basically encourage educators to become reflective practitioners or practitioners of the process of education that help them in thinking critically about the aims of education, the basis of education, the processes of education. And as reflective practitioners, educators, teachers are able to make informed decisions, to make ethical decisions, and to be context sensitive while they are making decisions in the field of education. So now, what are the main foundations? So first we begin with the philosophical foundations of education. Philosophy as a discipline provides the vision and the values that shape educational goals and methods. So every education system, or you can say syllabus or processes, these have certain goals and methods. And philosophy helps educators in clarifying their beliefs about the process of education, about what is knowledge, what is valid knowledge, who are learners, how do learners learn, what is the process of learning, and what is the process of teaching. So the focus basically in terms of the philosophical foundations of education, or the importance of philosophy for students of education, is that it helps us in focusing on the nature of education, the aims of education, and the values of education. So, for example, the key questions that philosophy as a foundation of education helps us in asking and trying to find answers to include questions such as: what is the purpose of schooling? What is the purpose of education? What knowledge is of most worth? What knowledge is more useful than maybe some other type of knowledge? And what should be the teacher's role? These are some of the important questions. There are obviously numerous other questions that the philosophy of education as the foundation of education helps us in asking and in raising. Now, some of the major philosophical philosophies that help us in understanding the process and aims of education better include, for example, perennialism. This philosophy basically emphasizes on asking questions related to enduring or lasting truth and great ideas or big ideas that have come to us through the process of education in a historical sense. So secondly, essentialism is another philosophy of education which focuses on core knowledge and discipline. So as the very name suggests, what are essential fields of knowledge that students should have exposure to? So, or in other words, what is it that every student in a particular society should compulsorily or essentially learn? Progressivism is another educational philosophy or types of educational philosophy that actually focuses on modernism in education. And so, for example, some of the modern philosophies of education include learner-centered philosophies of education or approaches to education that focuses on making learner as the center of the educational process rather than the teacher or the educational process. Similarly, progressivism also helps us, or you can say emphasizes experiential education or education where the student become active learner. Another interesting philosophy is existentialism. Existentialism basically is a philosophical school where the emphasis is on the existence before the essence, or you can say we are, therefore we think. In other words, the emphasis is basically on the individual's freedom. The student is the center of the learning process. So in this sense, you can say existentialism is something that coincides with progressivism. Existentialism also focuses on the self-direction especially of the learner in the teaching learning process. And similarly, social reconstructionism is another philosophy, modern philosophy of education that provides foundation to the modern process of education. And here education is considered as a tool for social reform. So you can see these are some of the major modern educational philosophies. There are numerous other educational philosophies that we can explore in some future presentation in this space. Now, the foundations of education also include ideologies and belief systems. So in every society we have certain ideologies, certain belief systems, and those ideologies and belief systems profoundly shape the process of education, the aims of education, the values that we want to promote through education, and the curricula or the kind of subjects that we include in the process of education. These are impacted by the ideologies that are paramount in a particular society. So, for example, certain societies which actually promote secularism as an ideology, they will have one type of education systems, while those societies which actually are based on more religious values and beliefs, they will have another type or another set of, you can say, systems of education. So we can say that our ideologies and beliefs, our social and individual ideologies and beliefs inform the process of education and shape the process of education. And so key considerations in this regard, like keeping in view ideologies and beliefs, include, for example, the influence of religious traditions. For example, some of the main religions in the world that shape the process of education include, for example, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Confucianism, and you can say certain other life philosophies or religious beliefs on life. And similarly, the secular approaches to life, societies that have more secular approaches to life, their education systems will be shaped by those philosophies. So, for example, secular humanism and education for rational citizenship, or citizenship that is based on rational thinking or scientific thinking. These will also shape the process of education in a society. The next foundation of education, we can say, is the influence of ideological forces, or forces such as, for example, nationalism, liberalism, Marxism, and neoliberalism are some of the ideologies. Some of these are, you can say, included as political ideologies or religious ideologies or social ideologies. And so these also shape our curriculum and the processes and policies of education. Generally, there is an interplay of faith-based and secular education, as we just discussed a while ago. In more pluralistic societies, there is generally emphasis on secular types of education, while in more religiously led societies, religion actually plays a more active role in the process of education, especially at the lower levels of education. So we can say that ideologies and our belief systems, they influence the need, that they influence our education systems. And as educationists, as teacher educators, or as becoming teachers, we need to think about, we need to be critically aware of the ideologies that shape our education systems. And similarly, we need to be aware of the ways in which education system actually shape or promote certain ideologies, whether religious ideologies or secular ideologies. At the same time, exposure to a variety of ideologies can also lead to a development of a more critical awareness. It can lead to tolerance and respect for diversity. Now, the other foundations include historical foundations. As we know that as humans, history plays a big role in our lives. We learn from history, and our actions also shape history. So one of the focuses of education is actually developing historical awareness or historical knowledge among students. So how educational ideas and institutions evolved over time, or what is the historical context of education, that is important. We as students of education need to understand the past, and understanding the past actually helps us in interpreting the current practices, and we can deal with the current challenges in the light of the understanding of our past. Key topics that include in the historical foundations of education, for example, include studying ancient education systems, for example, Greek education system, or the Romans and their education system, and similarly other traditions. The history of, for example, religious education, or the development of how did public schooling, for example, when was it that the idea of public schooling started? So how did public schooling or mass level education, when did it start, how did it grow, and things like that. Similarly, what is the historical role of educational reform movements? For example, some of the key modern reformers in education include John Dewey. So, what is his take on education? And similarly, Maria Montessori, which is who is an important and influential figure in terms of impacting school education, especially basic education, and Paulo Freire, who is a Brazilian educationist and who critiqued the very process of education. Similarly, we have sociological foundations. Education is basically an outcome, especially formal education, is an outcome of the needs and aspirations of a society. So while we are discussing sociological foundations of education, we ask questions related to the possible relationship between schools and society. So why do we have schools in the society? In what ways schools shape the society, and in what ways the society actually shapes the school? Should school play the role of an agent of socialization? What is the role of education, for example, in social concepts such as equity, diversity, and inclusion? Schools also, or education also, helps us in understanding concepts such as social stratification and education. So, what is the role of education? Is it unifying the society, or is it leading to stratification? It depends on the kind of education that we are providing. Similarly, cultural capital. What is the role of education, for example, in developing promoting cultural capital? What is hidden curriculum? In what ways is education, you can say, indirectly influencing the society and the role of the individual in the society? Similarly, a role of education in social mobility and reproduction. So these are questions that we discuss when we are actually studying the sociological foundations of education. Then the psychological foundations of education. Psychology and education often go together. We as humans are biological beings, but we are also predominantly psychological beings. And so because education generally aims at the overall development of humans, that is why psychology becomes an interesting discipline that shapes you can say, the multidisciplinary area that is called education. So one of the aspects of psychology, or understanding the psychological side of humans, is to understand, for example, the process of learning. So how humans learn and how do they develop? These are questions of psychology, but learning is an educational concept as well. That is why there goes the psychological foundations of education. There are several psychologies, or schools of psychology. You can also call them schools of the understanding related to the concept of learning. For example, behaviorism. Skinner and Pavlov are two psychologists who have worked on this and who consider that learning actually happens through reinforcement, or you can say learning comes through the impact of external forces. Cognitivism is another school of psychology that helps us in understanding learning. For example, the cognitivists such as Jean Piaget and Brunner, they believe in the internal mental processes, and they emphasize the importance of internal mental processes in the process of learning. Constructivism is another, you can say, theory of learning, which is promoted by Vygotsky, and so they believe, social constructivism rather, that learning happens through social or environmental interaction of the learner and the environment. Humanism, Maslow and Rogers are the main proponents of this school, and so they believe that self-actualization and personal growth should be the ultimate aim of education. Applications, then we can see that psychology is, you can say, especially educational psychology, is an applied field of psychology that helps us in understanding and developing instructional designs. These help us in classroom management as well. So education psychology helps teachers in managing their classrooms well. They help us, these fields actually help us, the teachers, to remain motivated and to keep their students motivated for the process of learning. And these also help us in the process of assessment, educational assessment. Now, education also have legal and political foundations. So in many cases, there are many educationists who believe that education is basically a political process, and so political systems and legal systems shape education, and therefore it is important for educationists and teachers to understand the legal and political environment in which a particular education system works. So education, therefore, is deeply shaped by, for example, law and policy. And education, for example, in terms of understanding, it is like one of the social sectors of life that is influenced by law and by the political environment. Why? Because the educational issues such as educational access and equity is not just education, but it's a legal and political right in many cases, that the citizens should have access to quality education, and there should be equity in terms of the provision of quality education in a society. Similarly, when we study the legal and political foundations of education, we have exposure as students of education to governance and accountability in schools. Similarly, these foundations of education help us in making good policies and good curricula. So policymakers and curriculum developers also need to have look at the legal and political implications of their educational decision making. And similarly, legal and political foundations helps us in understanding teachers' professional ethics and rights. Now, most importantly, education is a process that helps us in bringing more economic equity in the society, in developing citizens, in enabling citizens to take care of their economic welfare, and to bring in more economic justice in the society. So we can say that education and economy are deeply interdependent. Generally, economies that are developed have better education systems, good quality education systems, while on the other hand, less developed societies or countries, generally their education systems are not very well developed. So we need to understand this interplay, and so in order to economically develop, developing societies or developed societies need to understand the economic foundations of education so that they can develop their human capital, and so they can consider education as an investment in the skills and productivity, or in other words, in the economic development. They should understand the concepts of economic inequality and try to bridge the gap between the less economically developed sections of the society and the more developed ones through the process of quality education. Similarly, education, we also, educators and teachers, need to understand the interplay between education and the labor market so that the process of education is aligned with the workforce that is needed in the society. In many cases, we provide education that is not sufficiently quality education, and that does not ultimately lead to the provision of good economic prospects, or you can say jobs, to the graduates. Similarly, the economic foundations of education also help us in understanding, for example, globalization and new liberal reforms, where the market is based on competition and privatization and accountability. And therefore, quality education is important in order to deal with such competitions, especially in the job market. Then funding and resource distribution is another area that we study as teachers and educators when we study the foundations, the economic foundations of education. So these are important. So economic foundations are equally important as foundations of education. Now, because the foundations of education is one of the core subjects of teacher education, so we need to understand why do we have this subject in the teacher education, and what is the role of the foundational subjects in teacher education. So this is important, that we should have the foundations of education in the teacher education programs. Why? Because it helps us in critical reflection on the teaching process. What is the teaching process? Why do we need to have education? What is quality education? What is low quality education? What are the factors that impact education? Besides this, it also helps us, these subjects, or you can say the foundations of education, these help us in promoting ethical decision making. When we have the religious, the ideological foundations of education, when we study the philosophical and historical aspects of education, this helps us in making, as teachers, as educational leaders, as students of education, to make ethical decisions and to show professional responsibility. Besides this, these subjects help us in developing a philosophical stance towards education. And so we start asking the question of the why, the what, why, and how of education. Besides, these foundations helps us in developing good curricula, in developing effective pedagogies, and in analyzing educational policies in terms of its effectiveness in the society. And lastly, education, the foundations of, or the study of the foundations of education in teacher education helps us in building a foundation for research in educational theory and practice. Lastly, I have given here a few important scholars of education that the students of education might need to read in detail their works in detail in order to understand the concept of education, the process of education, and the foundations of education in more depth. So these include John Dewey, for example, an American educationist who have written several books, including The Influential Democracy and Education. And his focus basically is on experiential education, and he has critiqued the aims of, you can say, traditional education. And so he's one of the modern educationists to have shaped the aims and process of education that we see in the modern era today. Paulo Freire is a Brazilian educationist, was a Brazilian educationist, and you can say a social critic, who wrote a very influential book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, where he has critically looked at the process of education. And this is a kind of a radical theory related to education that just wants to revolutionize the process and outcomes of education. Similarly, in the field of education psychology, we have important education psychologists who have worked on, you can say, on the process of education, the theories of learning, such as Jean Piaget and Lev Vygotsky. They have worked on child development and educational psychology. Similarly, Jerome Bruner, who worked on learning theories, Emile Durkheim, and Pierre Bourdieu, who have worked in one of the foundational areas of education, that is the sociology of education. These are few. There are others who have worked on other aspects of education or other foundations of education, including economic foundations, political foundations, religious foundations, social or sociological foundations, and